I think that the best thing you can do if you've got your dinner-sized table team and you're trying to grow your business is to make sure that you're in a good headspace first, that you feel emotionally equipped, because challenges are going to fly your way. It's never easy. And even when it's great, there's always some undercurrent of, oh, we had returns, or this got a bad review, or something broke on the website. And you need to be in a place where you can show up for the people who are along for the ride with you and not lose your cool on all the little things, the bumps along the way. So that's what I would advise is secure your oxygen mask before helping others.
Hello and welcome to the Exponential Scale Podcast, the show where we talk about how tiny teams with big ambitions are doing more with less, scaling smarter, not harder, and building big businesses with teams that can fit around a dinner table. I'm your host, Ron Schmelzer, and on today's episode, we're talking with Scott Heimendinger, who is the founder and CEO of Seattle Ultrasonics. Hi, Scott. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Thrilled to have you here because you're a bit of a rare breed. That's the solo founder building a category creating hardware. And most startup founders choose software because it's cheaper to iterate, easier to find product market fit. But some founders go straight into the hardest possible category, physical products. Of course, there is harder. Going to space is a pretty hard problem. With a solo founder, I would say, will we see a solo founder space company one of these days? Well, possibly.
I think people have tried and have ended up institutionalized at the end of their journey.
Definitely understand. Well, for those of you that don't know, Scott Heimendinger is the founder of Seattle Ultrasonics, which makes the world's first ultrasonic chef's knives. And he spent the last 15 years working at the intersection of cooking and technology to try to make better tools for home cooks. And just for those of you that don't know, he's a cereal category creator. In 2013, his company Sansaire raised $823,000 on Kickstarter, at the time the #1 food and beverage campaign at the time, to democratize sous vide cooking with the $199 circulator, and that was over a decade ago. Since then, He served as Director of Applied Research at Modernist Cuisine, the world's definitive reference on culinary science, and as CMO and Chief Innovation Officer at Anova, the leading connected sous vide brand. And now he's back as a solo founder. So after 5 years of R&D, Scott launched the C200 at CES 2026, as mentioned, the world's first ultrasonic chef's knife. And it vibrates at more than 30,000 times per second using piezoelectric crystals, cutting through food with 50% less effort. He raised $2 million in pre-seed funding to build this entirely new category of kitchen tool. So in this episode, we're going to talk about building hardware without headcount, what it takes to spend 5 years developing a physical product as a solo founder, why he's chosen to stay small, what software thinking teaches you when you're iterating on atoms instead of bits, and of course, the other big thing for those of you that don't know, that Scott, he's been in this before. His background as a software engineer at Microsoft and IBM before making the hard pivot into food technology. And that explains a little bit about his social media handles as well. His Seattle Food Geek blog gained national attention in 2012 when Make magazine featured his DIY sous vide machine, and that attention became Sansaire, which I mentioned was the Kickstarter campaign that made sous vide accessible to home cooks. And he's also been inducted into the International Sous Vide Association Hall of Fame. He's been a Forbes 30 under 30, and now with Seattle Ultrasonics, after spending 5 years developing the C200, a fundamentally different kind of knife that uses ultrasonic vibration instead of sharpness alone. So, Scott, big of an intro there, but thrilled to have you here.
Man, I'm exhausted by my own bio. I've been at this for a little while, as you mentioned. I guess I'm just a sucker for punishment. I keep running back into the blazing inferno that is hardware startups trying to develop whole new categories.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a good place to start. Like, what is that mindset? What is the DNA or the mindset that really has you attracted to this space, being successful? And, what sort of mindset can you share for others that may be interested in approaching something similar?
Sure. At its core, the thing that is in common with every project that I work on professionally is that I want to try to help home cooks feel great about themselves in the kitchen. I believe that the whole world gets better in a tiny, maybe immeasurable way, the more people enjoy cooking at home. And there are lots of ways to help folks do that. There's, cookbooks and food TV education, and there's grocery delivery, and there's all sorts of things. But I am sort of an engineer at heart, and I really try to focus on opportunities to take some technology or approach or fundamental science that might have already existed or been proven out in like a commercial context or an industrial context, try to take the valuable bits of that, shrink it down, make it price accessible, redesign it, and see if it can help home cooks for the same reasons that it would help in a factory environment.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest insights for a lot of us that are familiar with iterating fast and doing a lot of development, usually with software. We think, okay, well, you can test things quickly, you can build things, get it into the customer's hands and see how things are working. But with hardware, there's a sense that there's this whole product development life cycle. There's a long time between having an idea and getting something into someone's hands. So what does that iteration look like? How do you sort of control the timeline, without, having to grow the team size and and raise lots of money to make it work?
It's a challenge. There is stuff about making hardware that is just waterfall shaped. In other words, things have to go sequentially, and if you want to change something upstream, you have to go back and change everything downstream. Sometimes in a very expensive way. So to give an example, we all have stuff probably within reach of wherever you're sitting that was made by plastic injection molding, right? It's the most common manufacturing technique for a lot of the stuff in our world. And that's because parts that come out of injection molds are very inexpensive and really precise, dimensional tolerance, all that kind of stuff, and can also be very strong and good looking and all this stuff. But the molds that you use to actually make these parts are carved out of, multi-100-pound blocks of solid steel that are instrumented with temperature sensors and moving parts and all this kind of stuff. And so for my knife, for example, for the ultrasonic knife, we've got a number of parts that were made by plastic injection molding, and that added up to almost $150,000 in tooling costs. And if I want to go make a change to the shape of something, it's not impossible. It's not that you have to throw the whole tool away, but you're talking about at least thousands of dollars, literally, welding metal back into a part that you've carved away, putting it back on a milling machine, milling this back out, polishing it again, testing it. So it's at least 4 weeks and many thousands of dollars to change anything. And in the software world, you go, oh, hey, we found a bug. Let's just fix the line and redeploy, and now you're good, right? It is a very, very different world. And so when you're developing hardware products, you really have to keep that in mind. You need to front load as much prototyping and testing and potential failure as you can, like really, really early, even more than you would ever do in software. And so it sort of changes the time scale and approach for getting a new product to market. The good news is that it has never been or cheaper to build hardware than it is today, tariffs notwithstanding. But as an example, electrical engineering, like making PC boards, right, with electrical components, it's a big part of a lot of hardware. That used to be like the process I described for injection molding parts. You got to work with some big firm and change the thing and reprogram the machine that's drilling holes and the whole deal. Now, anybody with a laptop and free software can design a PCB, maybe with the help of AI, certainly have AI sanity check it for you or make some recommendations, and then kind of hit file print. And for $5 plus shipping, you will get a set of boards 2 days later from China that are better than what any prototype shop could have done 15 years ago. So it is an amazing time, but it's still just a totally different beast than software.
Yeah, well, that's actually a good connection point here because when we think about, software, especially now with vibe coding, it's almost like the time between thinking of something and actually seeing a finished product is like down to like minutes, right? It's pretty crazy. Being able to understand the code is a whole different issue and debug it, but it's part of this whole rapid prototyping world. So do you think, coming into the hardware space from the software space, do you think that software mindset actually gave you any sort of advantage or gave you some sort of thought process when you started, especially when you started designing physical hardware, that maybe hardware first founders who don't have that sort of software background, maybe they don't have that perspective, and they maybe tend to do more things the way things have usually been done before?
I would say the one place in particular where the software background affected my thinking was that was in the software part of the hardware product. So I make an ultrasonic knife. It has one button and it has one job. You push the button, it turns on, and it vibrates and helps you cut food. But these days, the brain, putting a microcontroller or a microprocessor into a piece of hardware is ridiculously inexpensive. These chips are so powerful and so cheap that you might as well include something that you can program against, that you can, kind of treat like a software part of the stack. It's a little different. It's more like programming on very old computers, but the concept is similar. But what that allows you to do is plan for future proofing. So one of the first functions that I wrote into the firmware that runs on my knife is the over-the-air update. The chip has Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on it. I don't use Wi-Fi. It's just not necessary for my scenario. But I do use Bluetooth on it specifically so that you can load new firmware or run diagnostics or make little tuning changes and things, which allows me the flexibility to improve the product after it's been released. So finding ways, for example, to optimize the auto tune algorithm so that the knife stays in tune even better, finds the right resonant point more quickly. Optimize power consumption when it's asleep, add new features for various things down the road. And thinking of it like software, well, I have to build that entry point first, and then I can't accidentally break it. But after that, then sort of anything is possible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Where did the genesis of this idea come from? The ultrasonic knife. I like to watch a lot of cooking shows, and I've seen a lot of, I do a lot of cooking myself, but the thought hadn't crossed my mind about an ultrasonic knife. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about it, but maybe you could tell me a little bit about sort of the origin and sort of the problem fit and how you got to that product category.
For sure. It started because I knew that I wanted to go be an entrepreneur again. I had done Sansaire, my sous vide startup company that I co-founded, and I had gone back to Modernist Cuisine to continue working on some really cool, fascinating, fun projects, building all sorts of stuff. But then I just, the itch caught up with me, and I really wanted to go do my own thing again and try to help home cooks. But I didn't know exactly what I wanted to make. I was deep in my YouTube feed late one night, and it serves me all sorts of nerdy engineering videos and things. And I saw this video of a machine that was cutting different food products, things like cakes and sheet pans of brownies, marshmallow covered in chocolate, and vegetables, and all these and very delicate breads. And the machine didn't look like a knife at all. It was this big metal wedge attached to a robotic arm. And as it pushed through the food was not deforming, like it wasn't squishing. You'd push this super delicate soft bread and it wasn't squishing at all. It was just like slices were peeling off. but I could tell, and sticky things weren't sticking to this blade either. But I could tell that the blade itself wasn't actually that sharp. It's not shaped like a knife. It's quite thick by comparison. So that sent me way down the rabbit hole of what am I looking at? And it turned out what I was looking at was a commercial ultrasonic cutting machine. These have been around for a long time. If you've ever gone to Costco and bought the, pre-sliced cheesecake or the mozzarella log or, any of that kind of stuff, almost certainly they were portioned on a machine like this. And then I quickly found out that these machines, like most of them, you're talking tens of thousands of, not uncommon to spend about the cost of a family sedan to buy one of these machines. And the smallest and least expensive ones I could find were still at least $1,500, and then had this power supply larger than a shoebox that you had to plug into a wall. The whole thing was corded, and it didn't look like a knife, and you couldn't use it for normal knife stuff like mincing garlic or, chopping herbs or whatever. But I wondered, could I take the working parts of those things and shrink them down to fit inside the handle of an ordinary high quality kitchen knife? That's how it all started.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah. Going down the rabbit hole of watching YouTube videos. I think we've all been there, done that. Actually, that's actually ended up how I bought a piece of kitchen equipment myself. I was, I think had this scraper for the grill, and
the smarter scrubber.
Yes, the smarter scrubber, exactly. And he was just talking more about the challenges of trying to build something in the United States. That was his thing. He tried to do a chainmail. So I'm like, okay, I'm game. I'm gonna go order this thing, and I did. It took its sweet time to get here, but part of it was the idea that you're not really supporting a product as much as just supporting this idea of bringing manufacturing back. And actually, this is sort of a side topic here, but if more people are like you that are just have an idea and want to create something locally, I guess is this sort of a tipping point or an opportunity to sort of bring back some of the manufacturing that we've sort of lost the ability and capacity to do. There used to be a lot of small manufacturers a very long time ago, but we're not in that place anymore.
I think that we're in or entering a golden age for small artisan manufacturing. But unfortunately, I think it is still bad news when you're talking about mass production. And when I designed my knife, it was designed from the very beginning for mass production. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase "the best for the most for the least." Yeah. If you're familiar with that adage.
Yeah, usually it's a compromise, right?
Yeah, it's from the Eames Design Studio, the folks who make the very fancy chairs. But the idea behind that phrase, "the best for the most for the least," was you're trying to make the best quality product for the most number of people for the least money. And it's weird in the context of what is now a $7,000 lounge chair. But at the time, the idea was, well, if you want a nice piece of furniture, your only option is to have something kind of handmade from a shop, and it's not accessible. It's very expensive, and it's not for everyone to find it. And the stuff that I make, I want to be as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. My products are expensive, but they're not expensive because I'm really trying to wring a bunch of money or be like a luxury brand or something like that. They're expensive because a regular knife has 3 parts and mine has 248. So mass production is still, as Destin from Smarter Every Day showed in his Smarter Scrubber video, which is a wonderful video. Folks interested in manufacturing should go watch it. We've lost a lot of not just the capability, but the knowledge. So I talked about injection molding before. Designing the injection mold, like figuring out how the plastic should flow through it, is a science and an art. And we don't really have engineers in the US anymore who can design for that. So even if you can find a shop willing to carve that mold for you, finding the person to design it is still going to end up happening overseas. But the flip side, I said, it's a golden age for sort of artisan production. Folks just listening can't see this, but over my shoulder, I've got a tabletop sized CNC machine that was just a few $1,000s and is extremely easy to use and does a fabulous job. And so if I were only making hundreds of something, or, if I wanted to do some small scale production or high scale prototyping or whatever, the tools and the software and the communities have never been better than they are today for getting into that kind of thing.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, that's part of what we're talking about here. Especially if you're building something small, you don't necessarily need to, compete with the largest vendors. You just need to find your community, find your niche, and build for them, which is fantastic. Let's actually talk a little bit about the team size here. So tell me a little bit about your organization, how you set up, the team structure, and what I have here as my notes is that you were spending 5 years in R&D, largely solo, and you did raise a $2 million round, but for most of it, you were sort of in that sort of iteration. So can you talk a little bit about the team and how you're thinking about growing the team size, and how are you going to sustain it without burning through capital?
Yeah. For the first 4 years, I was literally by myself, just me doing everything. And the original intent when I started this project was not to build a company around it and do my own manufacturing and marketing and sales and ops and everything else that comes along with running a business. The original idea was to make a working prototype, file the appropriate intellectual property patents and so on, and then go out and try to license the idea to companies that already make stuff. I think that every entrepreneur, every founder has their sort of superpowers. I think that my superpowers are that I'm good at a wide variety of stuff. I'm not great at any of it, but I can design a PCB and test an electrical circuit and solder up a board. I can CAD up models and 3D print them and assemble a thing. I can, go to the bench grinder and shape a blade out of metal. I can put together a pitch deck. I can write patent disclosures. I can write firmware. I can do the sort of broad footprint of what is required to bring a new idea to life. And I can do it well enough to get to a working prototype, and then you sort of let your imagination fill in the rest. So that's what I was doing, was all of the above and a whole bunch more, usually spending each week finding 1,000 new ways to fail at making an ultrasonic knife for years. If there's a dent on my forehead, it's from smashing it against the workbench.
Okay. Not a grinder accident. That's good.
No. And so then I finally got there. I got to a working prototype, and I had filed some patents, and I had a beautiful pitch deck that I had rehearsed 86 versions of. And I went out to these companies whose names you've heard of to go do this pitch. And I got a really great response from them. They were very into it. I signed a deal with one of the companies. We had a 3-month diligence period. They kicked all the tires, looked under every rock, evaluated everything, found no problems. I was sitting on an airplane on the week of my 40th birthday, getting ready to take off for a trip to Mexico, when we finally got the final mutual agreement on the paperwork. And this deal would have put a lot of money in my pocket. Not huge yacht money, but like life-changing money for me. And the other party just never signed. Huh. They were about to post bad quarterly earnings, and they knew their stock was going to take a hit. And by the way, my deal size is a rounding error in their accounting, right, for a company like this. But they just Homer Simpsoned into the bushes. They left me with over $20,000 in legal bills for that month trying to negotiate this contract, and I was on my own. So that was the end of year 4.
I would like to say, that's unusual, but it sounds actually fairly typical for large companies that can't seem to get out of their own way.
Yeah. Anyway, once I picked up the pieces from that with a lot of support and guidance and encouragement from Rand Fishkin, who was recently a guest on your podcast. Rand convinced me that I could go raise money and I could do it without venture capital or institutional capital, and I could do it in a way that was founder friendly and investor friendly. And so I did. And raised about a $2 million round. And then that's when I could start working with more than just myself. So the first things I did was I partnered with a team actually that was related to two of my investors, with an industrial designer and a mechanical engineer and somebody to kind of help with branding and graphics and all that. And we went through a really great, creative, fun design process, figuring out what's the product going to look like and all that kind of stuff. I started working with a professional electrical engineer to take my designs and ideas and sort of graduate them up to actual manufacturable best practice. I don't know any of that, right? But here's how you do it if you weren't an idiot, kind of versions of the design. And then I started the sourcing process. So who were going to be my manufacturing partners for all of this? I went to China. I did my first China trip and met with some factories, and ended up failing out of China for my primary factory partner. So of course I've got suppliers, I've got a lot of suppliers, including the folks who make the blade and the folks who make the lithium battery and the folks who make some of the microchips. All those folks are in China. But the folks doing final assembly, putting the whole thing together, tuning the system up, making the circuit boards out of the components, injecting the plastics, all of that, they're a really critical partner. And I ended up finding them in Malaysia, which is wonderful and very excited. So right now, what the team looks like is I'm the only FTE. I have a contractor who was brought on to help with marketing, but has since expanded her role scope to help with operations and logistics as well. So customer service, handling some e-commerce stuff, and then also helping out with all the marketing we do. I've got a mechanical engineer who is on contract, is putting in a couple or dozens of hours a month, helping me with all of the designs for anything that's physical. I had an industrial designer. That person has rolled off because we're out of that phase. I have an electrical engineer who I work with sporadically when there's new things to do. I've got vendor teams for fulfillment, sort of third-party logistics, warehousing, that kind of stuff. I have my team at the factory, which is about 20 people or so who I communicate with for various things. And then I have a factory liaison and sourcing team. So they're a team who work for me, but help manage my relationship with the factory, help find additional vendors, and can be boots on the ground for me. So for example, if I'm having a problem with one of my suppliers in China, they'll send one of their people who's in China to go to the factory on my behalf and help work stuff out. And there are about 4 people there. So a bunch of people, but working in sort of small compartmentalized spurts. And this helps me keep the burn rate as low as possible, which is really important. And it also makes the burn rate quite variable. There's parts that I can turn off as needed and then fire up as needed.
Well, that's good. Yeah, and we've had so many great interviews on Scalable and the Exponential Scale podcast. And one of the people I mentioned who actually referred me to someone else, his name is Brennan Dunn, and he also has the same philosophy. He's just a single founder, but what you really do is you extend your network by working with a lot of other small business founders. And there's something empowering in that, because you can't be an expert at everything, but you can find other people who are. And his philosophy was that, if you employ someone, even though they may work directly for you, you are 100% responsible for their income and for their well-being. And if something's not working out, all of a sudden you have to, give that person 0%. Whereas if you're working with other individuals, everybody's spreading the risk around, right? You're not their sole source of income. They're not your sole source of supply, and you can really validate all of that. And I think I like that model, and I think it floats more boats. It allows more companies to be successful. So I really appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about that, because you talked a little bit about running lean here. One of the other challenges traditionally with hardware has been things like inventory and managing, tolerances, and of course you have returns, and you have to deal with, tariffs, which are not predictable by anybody, and other sort of factors in shipping and logistics. So how do you sort of navigate that whole thing, and keep your stuff flexible enough and give yourselves the leverage that you may not have if you were in a completely bit oriented world?
Yeah. I'm not going to lie, it's really hard. It adds so many layers of complexity that you just don't have to think about in a software or services world. And it's not easy. It feels like threading a needle, most months. Even when things are good, you're still threading these needles. Shipping product around the world, you like the boat can sink, right? Like this is a potential business risk that you sort of need to put on your radar.
A ship can jam the canal, if you remember that.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, this is a weird hypothetical, but a crazy person could start an international war that disrupts global shipping and sends commodity prices totally out of whack for no reason and with no warning. That's like a made up sci-fi thing. I don't know when that would ever happen, but you see what I'm saying.
Right.
Or like the cost to import your goods could jump by 20% with no warning one day. And for folks who aren't aware of this, I assume that everybody listening on here understands that tariffs are a tax, and tariffs get paid for by the company importing these goods, and therefore passed along to their customers, or combination of absorbed and passed along. But what you might not realize is that yourself have to pay the tariffs up front. So suppose you're buying 3 or 6 months worth of inventory. You pay the tariff bill for that inventory the minute it hits the port, and you have to pay it up front. Otherwise, they will throw your goods in the trash. That is just crushing for cash flow. You've got this big, hard to predict bill that you pay for way ahead of time, and then have to go, recollect later on for customers. And although I raised $2 million, $2 million is not an enormous figure in the hardware world, right? That for a typical hardware company, it's actually pretty small. Yeah. And so making this all work between pre-orders and the initial raise is just a really tricky game of logistics and controlling spend, and having a really detailed financial model is absolutely critical. Something that forecasts out over time all these costs and when the bills for each part of the cycle are going to land. So, for example, when I do a new production run, there's a certain part of my bill of materials that is long lead, that takes more than 4 weeks to order. So we place a long lead time order. I pay a deposit on just those components. Then when we kick off the actual orders, as I say, hey, make me 100 knives or 1,000 knives or whatever, then I pay a deposit on that. And then when the knives are made, then I pay the rest so they can leave the factory. And then when they hit the water, I get a bill for the tariffs, and then there's a shipping fee that's later, and then they get put into warehouses, and then later I get, a month after they ship, I get billed for the shipping fees. And so there's just this very long chain of all the dollars associated with each unit of product that don't land at the same time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, I would imagine that's part of where things like pre-orders and Kickstarter comes in part to One, determine demand. That's
Mhm.
important. Get early feedback, but I would imagine also provide a bit of a buffer. For this, you're basically using those pre-orders to cover some of those costs, in addition to the funding. I would imagine that plays a major role there.
That's right. Pre-orders were really critical for me being able to launch successfully. I had the funds to just outright pay for my first production run if I needed to, but the pre-order gave me signal for what does demand look like and helped bring in some cash early in time so that I could start to ramp up for the other thing. Now, it's we're recording in early April.
Mhm.
Pre-orders opened in September. I am still back ordered, and I will be for another month or so at least. So, unlike a large company with deep pockets where they could afford to just place orders and get caught up and be in stock, I have to I have to be judicious about each push of the flywheel, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, actually, this is kind of interesting point. You came out of the software space, entered the hardware space. There's a lot of things to learn. And now, how did you build your knowledge, your expertise, especially when you were talking about all these aspects of the build process, the team that you pulled together, even that remote, to know how to pull together that team and where to go to pull that team, especially in other countries where you don't necessarily speak the language. Like, how did you build that expertise and your sort of advisory group, if you will?
I mean, honestly, I feel like I just stupided my way through it, right? Like, I started out, I started out thinking like I understood how this stuff might worked. Where what I didn't understand was where I was on like Naivety Mountain. And had I known how naive I was at the beginning, I never would have started.
Really
Right?
interesting.
If I knew how difficult and how long and how expensive and how emotionally draining this whole process was, I probably wouldn't have done it. But if I knew what I knew now, I would have just bought Nvidia stock and put my feet up on a desk somewhere and made art. No, honestly, I kind of figured out each step as I went, and had to teach myself most of the skills that I ended up needing. Some I was lucky that I had developed skills in my previous job that ended up being useful in my current job. So when I was at Modernist Cuisine the last round, that's when I started learning CAD and 3D modeling. I had access to the machine shop there. And so I learned how to start making things on different types of tools and how to think about physical manufacturing and assembly and stuff. I made my first circuit boards there. So whenever you have the opportunity to learn on someone else's dime, of course, you should take it. And that stuff came in total handy. We also have to remember, though, that so now 6 years ago, so I started in 2020, we're in 2026 now. So full 6 years ago, there weren't LLMs and AI agents and chatbots and coding assistants to help climb this mountain. I was reading through data sheets myself and trying to find reference textbooks, which were both impossible to follow, applicable. And it was really hard. There was almost no content for the stuff I was trying to learn about ultrasonics on YouTube, or not a whole lot on the internet. Now, it feels like a very different story. If you have an entry point into something, being able to use AI can really help you learn and climb Naivety Mountain so much faster and avoid a bunch of pitfalls and avoid spending a ton of time and energy on things that are the wrong thing. So, I feel like if I were starting again now, fresh, what took 4 or 5 years before might take a year or year and a half now. So folks starting out now, I think, have a tremendous advantage.
Well, that's actually good to know. People don't necessarily think of LLMs or AI as necessarily accelerators for advice, but actually that is true. I mean, at the very least, you're going to get the collection of what's out there on the internet and all the information there. And that's certainly a lot more than you might know on your own. And it certainly is better than opening up 50 tabs and trying to click through it and understand things, and you can't talk to the websites anyways and say, like, well, this uses this word. I don't even know what this word means. And, I really do appreciate that. That's actually really good insight. And actually, you were talking a little bit about, as you're sort of building this expertise, this is your second go around. So did the first experience in 2013, did any of that with the Sansaire device, did any of that carry through to the second time, or it might as well have just been, from scratch all over again?
No, it did, certainly. But funny enough, the stuff that carried through the most from my first startup experience to this one was about marketing and go to market and press and PR, much more than about hardware.
Well, that's actually a good point. So another big thing is finding that audience, so figuring out your ICP and figuring out how to target them. What process did you go through? Did you already have connections in this market from the first time, or through the new experience? Maybe you could talk a little about how you are getting to your market.
Yeah. I've worked in this arena, the sort of, you could call it food tech, smart kitchen. It goes by some names. It's not a very big world. It's a pretty small number of players compared to the size of lots of other worlds. But I've been working in it, basically since it started in the late 2000s, where you started to see the sort of science working its way into the kitchen and new generations of devices trying to take advantage of better understanding of how cooking actually works. And so I feel like I understand this world pretty well, and I know what some of the players and the strategies and the media and the kind of relevant voices are. I'm more than 10 years older than I was the first time around. And so a lot of the folks who were most influential my first time are now maybe a little old school compared to who's influential now. And that's okay. But it is largely the same playbook. I would say that the biggest thing that these two products have in common, both sous vide, I did home combi oven for Anova was in the middle, and then ultrasonic knife, is that you're introducing people to a brand new, not just product, but product category. It's a thing that they're probably hearing about for the very first time. And so you have an enormous educational burden to try to explain what it is, how it works, and how it can help them.
That's really interesting. I've been taking a lot of notes here even as we've been talking, because there's a lot of things that carry over from one industry to another. And there's some things that are just the way things are now done, especially with the way that we can accelerate both the development process, the learning process, the contact process, and just the connection process, which is, I think, a good sign for everybody on that. And I want to get into that a little bit about the acceleration bit here. You launched at CES, which is sort of an interesting experience in and of itself. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, how do small team founders, crack into these bigger circles? What's it like, being with the largest brands that are there? Did licensing actually come up again? Maybe you were seeing some of these folks in person again, and they may see you there, and they may think, well, wait a second, this is happening. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that whole experience and what it's like as a small team founder working in those circles.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think every startup struggles initially with the same challenge, which is how do we get people's attention, right? Like, how do we break through, especially if you don't have big budgets to throw at advertising and stuff, which I don't. And frankly, I don't like, that's not my style. I would prefer to earn your attention rather than to pay for it whenever possible. So we did our launch in two phases. First was literally turn on the website and put up a YouTube video, and that happened in September. And amazingly, that just took off. That got a ton of traction. Within a week, we had over 500,000 YouTube views.
Wow.
From a close to empty channel, from a nearly blank channel. And those were fully organic. That was just the algorithm serving it to people and people finding it, responding positively. Oh. And it drove just a gargantuan amount of sales. That was a really great little moment in time. And then CES was in January. So 3 and change months later. And that was meant to be sort of our big press debut, right? This was the first time that a bunch of journalists would be able to be hands-on with the product and actually see it in person. The plan and the strategy for CES, which is how I think about any major launch, is you were trying to start a snowball that becomes an avalanche. In other words, you're trying to concentrate as much attention, as many mentions as possible into the tightest amount of time so that it bubbles up and gets folks' attention. So that, for example, rises in what people are talking about at that moment on Reddit or on, sort of other places like that, or on algorithmic social feeds, so that it has a chance to catch fire and really build and go. And CES runs a program called Unveiled, which is the night before the show or 2 nights before the show actually opens. It's a big room and it's not cheap to attend, but none of CES is cheap to attend.
Right.
And everybody gets a 6-foot table and it's like 3 or 4 hours where the only people allowed in the rooms with you are qualified journalists. So kind of a cool level playing field that LG and Samsung get a 6-foot table, and so do we. And the thing about CES, I've been going to CES since I was maybe 14 years old. I would go with my dad and whatever, and I've seen it. There is shockingly little year over year that's actually net new. It'll be like, oh, cool, the refrigerator comes in a new color now, or this camera now has some more megapixels or whatever. That, there now and then there are really cool, big, disruptive innovations, but a net new thing doesn't come along that often. And then besides that, something in food, a new product, a new innovation in food also doesn't come along that often. And so you think about all the outlets where somebody is responsible for the food beat. Basically, we're guaranteed to capture their attention. And then all of the folks whose CES coverage is like, check out the new stuff I saw this year at CES. Well, when you've got a product that is fundamentally new and different, you're also quite likely to capture their attention. So we got a ton of press, just absolutely flooded with press. And that layer, that sort of core of the snowball of people who actually came to our table and used the knife and made a little video or put up an article or whatever, that then created the next shell of people doing coverage because they had heard about it from the first round, and so on until they're talking about our product on like the French equivalent of Good Morning America, and they had never even talked to us. They grabbed our B-roll from our press kit and thought the thing was and like all this coverage that happened in this organic manner by trying to focus attention and having something that would fundamentally stand out in a noisy environment.
Yeah, so it sounds like this was part of the plan. That CES, soon after the YouTube, it sounds like you knew that this was going to be part of that momentum building exercise. And it sounds like it wasn't cheap, but a solid investment. And where did you just get that insight? Because that that's a great place to launch a consumer, kitchen gadget. Like there's really nothing like CES to create that.
It's because at the time, it still is true now. Our goal was not we want distributor relationships. Our goal was not we need to increase wholesaler deals or whatever. The goal was press attention, and of all the trade shows and whatever, CES was the best fit for what we were doing. And I had seen this playbook work by doing trade shows and working with sort of traditional media in my past goes. It's kind of an old school playbook, right? It's very different from hiring a TikTok influencer to dance with your product, right? That's sort of a new school thing.
That would be interesting in your case.
Right. It's, engaging with press and making sure they have what they need to write good coverage is not a new idea. I had seen this work before. I hope that it would work. Of course, nothing's ever guaranteed, but in our case, it worked better than I ever could have imagined.
Yeah, that's actually really good insight. And as mentioned, I think there are people who are listening who may have sort of similar consumer products, may not necessarily be in food tech, but they may have products like this and they're struggling with a lot of the same ideas. And, maybe that's a good sort of final question before we get into our rapid fire round here. I always ask the same three questions to all of our interviewers. But I guess for this question, if a founder came to you today with a genuinely like a new idea and a category creating hardware idea, not some iteration, something really new, what's maybe some advice you'd give them, or maybe some things that they should say, you should definitely follow this sort of playbook as you're putting this into market, or maybe something that they may be misunderstanding or underestimating from your own advice, kind of what direction would you send them?
There are two things that come to mind. The first is I believe strongly for these types of things in using content creation as a pillar of your marketing strategy. So we live in a zero-click world, coined by Amanda Natividad, who works with Rand at SparkToro, which means that folks are going to see your content in their algorithmic feeds, and you cannot hope that they follow a link to your website where you get an attribution for that sale. The hardest thing about a category defining innovation is getting people to understand it. You will have a lot to say about this because it's new and you're the only one who knows about it. So own your own content creation pipeline. Don't outsource the key messaging and the things that you want people to learn to other creators or even an advertising agency or whatever. You should really do those things yourself. And the second, which maybe ought to come first, is to find a conference and exhibit there. The reason is that when you're doing booth duty and you've got 1,000 people coming by each day, you will start the morning of day one with whatever you think your product pitch is. And you will end the afternoon of day three with the most concise, refined, effective version of that pitch because you have been doing your stand-up comedy routine 1,000 times a day and noting where you get the laughs or the head nods or people walk away from the table or whatever. That is the best machine for refining your pitch is just the type of rapid practice that you get in a conference environment. So I would say in that order, probably go exhibit at a trade show just for the practice, and then take what you learn about how people respond and put it into your own content marketing.
Great advice. Well, as mentioned, I could be talking to Scott here for a good couple hours, and we'll link to some of the great things that Scott has already talked about in other podcasts and other places. So I really appreciate this insight. So as mentioned, we have the same three questions here that we ask all of our great guests because we get different answers every single time. So the first question, of course, is tools, because everybody wants to know, like, what's one tool or automation or software or AI that you absolutely can't run your business without, the one that gives you the 10x leverage every single week?
I'm going to give you two. The first is Gorgeous, which is the platform that we use for help desk. It ties into Shopify. It's got AI agents that you can train to do various things. We've actually turned those off because for the shape of our business, we really want hospitality to come through in a human approach. But Gorgeous is really seamless, and it's the perfect way for keeping all of our customer service information organized, easy to access, and actionable. The second, which is very different, it's not going to apply to most of the people listening, is my tabletop CNC mill. I love being able to create the part I need the same day out of steel or aluminum or titanium or plastic or whatever. And had I had a machine like this years ago, it would have sped up a whole bunch of my prototyping workflow. So big fan of the Carvera and their products.
Great. That's good to, that's pretty powerful. So the next question has to do with processes and methods. What's one system or process that you think every lean, leverage first team should have in place by the time they hit their first $1 million in revenue? Maybe something you should tell them to stop doing that they're doing now, or what should they start doing today?
I think having a detailed financial model that ahead of time that lets you analyze your sensitivities is really key. Now, this might apply to hardware more than it applies to software, but in having a model that lets you say, okay, here's our sales projections. Here's, a great case. Here's a medium case. Here's the dangerous case, right? Now, what if tariffs go up? Now, what if returns are above this level? Now, what if we get a ton of orders really early? Well, the business can crash that way too. What if we don't get enough orders? Well, the business obviously can crash that way. And so figuring out where those sensitivities are, does adding another person to the payroll for customer service work really change the slope of your financial trajectory? Or is that much more about your cost of goods or a shipment delay or something like that? That's, yeah.
That's good. Financial planning and modeling. Excellent. So I guess the last bit here is, I know you've given a lot of tips and advice to our listeners here, but if you can give one piece of advice to a founder who's running that dinner table size team right now, who wants to scale, maybe what's something you'd share from your experience or from what you've observed in the space?
This may be a different answer than maybe you had in mind or that other folks would give. I recently experienced some burnout after working on this for 6 years. And although I have fantastic help from talented people, there's a ton on my shoulders and there's a whole bunch of work that I'm the only one who can do. And for all of the success that we've had launching this product, which I'm really proud of and makes me so excited, the internet is full of people who are snarky or have opinions, and the comment sections are rarely a nice place to hang out. And my relationship to my work got kind of broken to the point where, I'd get a physical reaction to walking in my office, which is, by the way, the guest room of our apartment, keeping it lean. I managed to clear my head and get a little time away and adopt some better practices. Nothing revolutionary. It's all the stuff that everybody tells you to do. Get sleep, exercise, try to reduce your stress. Normal stuff that's just so easy to postpone. I think that the best thing you can do if you've got your dinner size table team and you're trying to grow your business is to make sure that you're in a good headspace first, that you feel emotionally equipped, because challenges are going to fly your way. It's never easy. And even when it's great, there's always some undercurrent of, we had returns, or this got a bad review, or something broke on the website. And you need to be in a place where you can show up for the people who are along for the ride with you and not lose your cool on all the little things, the bumps along the way. So that's what I would advise is secure your oxygen mask before helping others.
That's actually a great little clip there. I may actually use that in our feature. But I think that's great advice. When you are a small team, especially if it's just you, then you have to take care of yourself because there's no one else there to take care of it. So I think that's perfect. So thank you, Scott, so much for participating, for sharing, for being so generous with your time and sharing all these great insights with our audience.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for what you do. I think this is an important service to help other folks who aren't trying to scale to unicorn status realize and feel empowered to go chase the dreams of their business.
Exactly. Well, that's what we're here for. We're here to build awareness, and interviews with folks like you help to do that and make people realize that this is not a rarity. As a matter of fact, this may really be the biggest movement in entrepreneurship in the last couple decades. So I want to thank you, Scott, again for participating. And for our listeners who want to learn more, as mentioned, you can learn more about Seattle Ultrasonics by going to seattleultrasonics.com. Hopefully you can spell that SEATTLE. ultrasonics.com. The C200 is available for pre-order at $399 with the knife and charging tile bundle at $499. We're going to link to it in our show notes. Obviously hoping for major success. We're going to keep track of all this. So I think we want you to be as successful as possible. You can find Scott on Instagram and Threads at Seattle Food Geek. And as always, we have a mantra for the week. So the mantra for this week is accelerate your learning and iterate, because it can be done with hardware just as much as software. We got a lot of great insights and tips on how to make that work. And if you loved this interview with Scott Heimendinger, I want you to hit that subscribe button, leave a review, and share it with that founder friend who's still thinking that software is the only thing that you can build in this new economy of vibe coding. The answer is no. I think this new economy really does allow greater numbers of people to build greater things. So I want you to think big, stay lean, and scale smarter. Micro teams aren't the future, they're the now. If this episode got you fired up, hit that subscribe button, share it with your crew, and join the movement over at scalebrate.com. That's SCALEBRATE.com. Till next time, think big, stay lean, and scale smarter. Because you're not a tiny team, you're a micro team with mega potential. So get exponential, and thanks for tuning in to the Exponential Scale Podcast.